Once again, we have been provided with a Pantheon Rise of the Fallen developer roundtable with a good amount of new information in it. This time, the guest developer was Ceythos LeFever, who is a senior game designer. And one of his primary jobs is designing the crafting and harvesting system. And he spent about an hour just rattling off as much info as he could about the crafting and harvesting. So, as you've come to expect here on BazgrimTV, let's take all that information and boil it down to what you really need to know. So here are what I would consider the top 5 takeaways from the August 2019 Pantheon Developer Roundtable.
This is BazgrimTV. Learn, laugh, level up.
Now, there actually is a pretty decent amount of information already available to the public about Pantheon's crafting and harvesting systems. Over the past couple years, Corey has written 3 newsletter articles, and also back in 2018, I did a pretty lengthy interview with him, which expanded on some of those articles. So, if you're brand new to Pantheon's crafting system and you want to learn more about it, the first thing you should do is go to the description of this video right now and read those articles and watch that video in order, and then come back here, because today I'm going to focus on the things that are either totally new or provided more clarity based on those original pieces as a foundation. And if you always want to be able to stay in the loop about all the latest Pantheon news, hit the subscribe button now, because that's what this channel is all about. But enough about me, let's get into the highlights. The first is about how crafters can make a real and tangible impact on the world of Terminus. Crafting in Pantheon isn't just about constantly making stacks of items to grind XP and level up your crafting skills. You can actually provide something of value for the people around you that's not just items.
For example, imagine provisioners meeting up at a tavern and having a cooking party. With enough participation, a nearby table or counter might spawn a feast that people passing by could interact with for a buff. Similarly, imagine a scenario where alchemists might gather an apothecary and whip up some potions. A nearby cauldron or flask rack might have a random or fixed potion or poison effect that, passers-by could consume to see if they are lucky or not. But, it's kind of a hazard when you're reaching into unknown stuff, I suppose. Another type of crafting-related event I'd like to see is allowing crafters to complete certain types of writs to buff NPCs in the surrounding area. Completion of enough of the appropriate blacksmithing writ, for example, might give nearby guards better armor for a while, or completion enough woodworking writs might give nearby archers better arrows for a period of time. I'd also like to see crafters able to influence vendor supplies through quest writs or quests or writ completions. For example, enough of the appropriate stonemasonry writ might spawn a limited supply of gems, ores, and related crafting materials to nearby vendors that sell those kinds of things.
Secondly, Corey addressed how to keep crafted items relevant and desirable compared to gear that is acquired by adventuring. Because this is a problem that a lot of MMOs have, especially at the higher levels. But Corey believes that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
It's very important to the team that items have and largely retain their own identity. Both categories of items will provide unique items that can only be found either by looting them or crafting them, or looting them parts of them first and crafting them. Rather than looking at how they can compete with one another, I'd rather see it as how they can complement one another. There's a few ways we might achieve this. Simplest way is through alteration of an existing item to gain a new item with its own identity. Some examples might be taking Eridune's flaming sword from a lengthy and difficult adventuring quest chain. There might be a recipe or crafting method to transmute those stats and the effects into Eridune's thundering blade or Eridune's freezing cutlass. Another example might be a crafted robe. Robe of the Last Magi, just pulling stuff out of my bum here, but might be a powerful item with its own hefty stats and a passive mana regen effect or something to that effect. It might be tradable to a wandering or summoned spirit from bygone age, giving players the opportunity to receive a war wizard's drape in exchange with its own unique stats and a passive spell damage effect, or something on par in relative power to the crafted robe. Providing opportunities in adventuring related quests to have crafting alternates, like quest completion conditions and vice versa, would be another way we can sort of have them coexist and complement each other. Having an upgrade path for adventuring related items through crafting, allowing players to increase existing stats and potency of existing effects on an item by a fixed percentage. So you're gonna get that sweet raid loot. I don't know, Sword of Dragon Slaying and you want to have 5% more potency on the existing stats, and maybe it's got like a Dragon Bane DD effect that only affects dragons, and you could, increase the damage by a fixed percent as well through the upgrade path. It covers a lot of the professions with equipable slots. It doesn't really cover so much like alchemy and provisioning, so I kind of imagine the way that plays out is slightly improved potency from the consumables, like if it's a heal effect or a buff effect of some sort, like you would see that, see a similar increase. Improved effect durations in the upgrades, so if it was a 10-minute buff from a potion, it might instead be like a 12-minute buff. Possibly even allowing like for group consumption in the case of like an upgraded like alchemy recipe or provisioning recipe might be able to put down like a keg or a feast, or in alchemy's case like a cauldron or flask pot people can reach into.
Third, Corey elaborated on his stance toward node scarcity. This is actually in response to a concern that some people had raised after my interview with Corey, where he stated that harvesting nodes would be considerably less common than you might find in other MMOs. But in this roundtable, he took the opportunity to provide some more clarity about what he means by that.
When I'm speaking of node scarcity, what I'm talking about is finding a balance where players will be actively hunting for resources rather than running the same predictable loop, to get the same like 24 nodes every 3 minutes, like we've seen in other games. Ultimately, I want players to feel great about finding a node without tripping over them. We'll be relying very heavily on like server logging and player feedback to make sure we hit the right balance between feeling starved and feeling slightly hungry when it comes to finding nodes. With that said, it will also be important that recipes not require mounds of harvested items to make a single finished product, or that crafting components and like finished items yield a healthy amount of crafting EXP per craft. If we're working with a paradigm that finding materials is going to be we're going to be on the hungry side of finding them. We've definitely got our work cut out for finding the right balance, but I'm pretty certain with good data and feedback we can find it. It's like certain climates may only grow like certain types of plants for provisioning or alchemy, for example. Like those are, I think, pretty easy examples to think of. Like plants only grow in specific places. Visiting a farm in Thronefast could be wildly different than, say, going to a grove in Fairthale to look for ingredients. The types of flowers, the fungi, the roots, they're all different from one another. So there'll have to be some care that there's enough ingredients to start crafters on their journeys in each respective like starting area. It's not realistic to ask players at level 1 to see 2 or more zones just to even start beginning crafting meaningfully. Geographical seeding may mean, in terms of like comparing 2 iron mines in different locations, one mine might have like level 20-ish bandits holed up in them, and another might have level 40-ish orcs in the area. In the bandits' mine, iron comes from ore veins, and the iron goods in their possession are standard iron. In the orcs' mine, iron still comes from the iron veins as expected, but they've got a special way maybe of tempering their iron goods. We'll just call it like blood iron as an example. Salvaging blood iron could yield blood iron scraps or components, regular iron scraps or components, or whatever agents they use in the tempering process. This also points to reuse of seemingly simple materials along the horizontal and vertical progression of crafting, which should help keep some of the more humble resources in demand. Encountering some of the more basic material types in areas where higher level adventuring content takes place might also provide higher yields. So if I'm finding moon orchids in a level 40 area, it might give 2 to 3 times the yield that finding it in a level 10 area would, since typically the higher level areas are going to have more difficulties around them, whether it's asking people to traverse long distances or remote places filled with like climates or higher level hostile NPCs and stuff.
And speaking of the importance of in-game economy, Corey also dropped a little hint about how players will interact with merchants, because in addition to designing the crafting and harvesting systems, Corey is also responsible for monitoring the in-game economy, since it is of course closely related. This detail about merchants is something I don't think he's ever actually mentioned before, and it's a fun little way to make merchants more realistic, while also encouraging players to think more about where they're selling their goods.
That I would like to maybe consider is soft encouraging players to sell their unwanted items to merchants that would be most interested in the particular category of the item being sold. So if a player has some jewelry, for example, that they want to sell, they could take it to a jewelry merchant and they'd get the full price of the item's sell value. but maybe that jewelry merchant is in the middle of a nearby capital, and rather than travel there, our sample adventurer wants instead to like go to the city gates or a nearby outpost and to sell to a general merchant instead. Time's money after all, right? Any other merchant other than the jeweler in this case might only offer like 80% of the sale value of the items in question. If we encourage players to sell their items to the most relevant vendors, they're in a way helping like restock the merchants with appropriate category of items some of the time. If it's successful in encouraging that player behavior, vendor divers will have a better experience finding the category of item they're after. Unless you're like me and you just like to thrill the treasure hunts, you're going to look at all the merchants anyway.
Lastly, Corey provided a little update on his view toward group harvesting. This is actually another concern that came up after my interview with him, because originally he had said that there were no immediate plans for group harvesting in Pantheon. But the sentiment of the community is that if Pantheon is a very social and group-centric game at its core, and the crafting side of the game is trying to reflect the progression of the adventure side of the game as much as possible, then shouldn't there be at least some way to harvest as a group? Well, thanks to a new idea posed by another team member, there's now at least a chance that that may actually happen.
I don't think we fundamentally have an issue with providing like social opportunities where we can, especially with harvesting and possibly even crafting as well. Where we run into some issues is if grouping up provides the most rewarding yields, and it sort of becomes the best, or in some people's perception, the only way to harvest, and it could greatly widen the funnel for like the amount of items that are hitting the economy. Like when we saw, in Vanguard, and you had your group ups, it exponentially increased the amount of harvested materials everyone received.
And the rares, potential for rares increased. That was really handy.
Yeah, and it's cool. It has its own, again, kind of like economy implications. Ikic, or Wyman, had suggested recently that he had an idea that might gain some traction. Players might be able to group up and harvest, allowing them to combine their skill levels to harvest nodes well above like their individual skill level. In fact, it could be like a requirement at times. So, the perceived end game of the current content, players might need to come together to harvest some really crazy like meteorite or something that struck the planet.
That's cool.
In this case, we could have yields that adhere to the loot rules that are currently in place for grouping, rather than adding like extra items to the yield. It could be round robin, master loot, randomized, whatever. Combining skill values might be nice, since we've already talked about having nodes placed geographically rather than along like forced level adherence as well. So, you might be in a level 10 area, and maybe you see some nodes that are well above like what your current skill threshold would be, and you're able to access that, whether through cunning or cowardice, like sneaking behind a group that's clearing the area, whatever it happens to be. Gotta love that open world social experience. But you stumble on a node that you yourself couldn't like on your own harvest, because that area happens to have iron or mithril or whatever it happens to be, or some higher level tree. Call on your friends, go harvest it, have at it. I think that could be a good experience, but again, we got to get the core experience has to be good and solid first before we can really explore too hard on that.
On that note, I think it's really important to mention that toward the end of the roundtable, Corey mentioned how we may hear him talk a lot about what his ultimate goals are for the crafting system. And there's actually already a very basic version of crafting and harvesting in the game and working. And it's not like he just can't make up his mind about how to move forward from here. But the team will need to collect a lot more data from players in alpha and beta about how the economy is affected by these different things before they can actually start to implement the more detailed aspects of the systems. And so until then, it's important that he keep his plans fairly flexible so that he can make more informed decisions. With all that in mind, you should now be caught up on all the news from the August 2019 Pantheon Developer Roundtable. And if this sparked your interest and you just can't get enough of Corey, I'll provide a link so that you can watch the entire roundtable. Because like I said, I was pretty much only able to hit the highlights here today. But that's all for this one, so until the next video, my name is Bazgrim, and thanks for watching.